Hi, my name is Mark Ward and I'm the Festival Programmer for the Redline Book Festival brought to you by South Dublin Libraries. We're delighted to be celebrating our 10th anniversary festival with 84 events happening in person, online or both. Please check out redlinebookfestival.ie for the full programme, and the festival runs until Sunday the 17th of October. I'm thrilled to welcome back to Redline Andrew McMillan, who will be discussing his new collection, Pandemonium. Andrew will be in conversation with poet, critic and Redline Book Festival poetry competition judge Seán Hewitt. Seán will be hosting our Poetry Awards night in the Civic Theatre on Wednesday the 13th of October, and we have many more poetry events throughout the week. John McAuliffe and Michael Schmidt will be talking on Tuesday the 12th of October. Liz Quirk and Amarini Caron will be in discussion about second collections with poet Jessica Traynor on Thursday the 14th of October. And Victoria Kennethick, Aoife Lyle and Jessica Traynor will be discussing literary motherhood on Thursday the 14th of October, as well as much, much more. But first, we're delighted to welcome you into the world of Andrew McMillan's Pandemonium.
Hello, everyone. I'm Seán Hewitt, and I am delighted to be joined today by Andrew McMillan, who really needs no introduction, but I will run through a few of his many achievements before we kick off with an interview and a reading. Today, what we're going to do is Andrew will do a reading of a couple of poems. I'll ask a couple of questions, and then we'll hear some more poems and just alternate like that all the way through. Andrew's first collection, Physical, won the Guardian First Book Award. It was the first ever poetry collection to do so. Physical also won the Fenton Aldeburgh First Collection Prize, was shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas, the Costa, the Forward Prize, Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year, many, many more. His second collection, Playtime, won the Polari Prize. But the book we're here to talk about today is Pandemonium, his third collection, which I think is his most trenchant and beautiful book yet. And I think what's really special about this book and about Andrew is that Pandemonium shows a writer who's not content to stop exploring the boundaries of his craft. It feels like we're constantly propelling forward in what Andrew is capable of. And I think this book is a testament to his very huge capabilities as a writer. It's moving and it's visceral and it's vulnerable and it's political too. And I can't wait to hear Andrew read from it today. So Andrew, welcome. I wonder if you'd start off with the first poem, perhaps.
For how many years had you carried it before you felt it? How long had it sat, growing as you grew, built of your own skin? Tumour, parasite, and itching until you looked. Who was it showed you? Who gave you the key? Your not self, sick self, the long worm body of your blood wrapped tight around your brain, and you opened up, found you could not shut, no matter how long you screamed in your bed. Panic, loosed, bedlam, pandemonium.
Thank you very much.
You are welcome.
I suppose one of the first things that a reader or a listener might notice of that poem, especially when they're familiar with your other work, is you. You as the addressee of the poem. And often, well, really, I think you're renowned for the lyric eye, these beautiful queer lyric poems. And I wonder if you could talk about the process of switching into address in the lyric. Did you feel like you were pushing the bounds of that lyric eye, or what the lyric poem could do for you? How did it feel?
I think, I think that's an interesting question. You're a very smart guy. I think that I don't know if I had a kind of a sense that I was doing it at the time. I think that it was, these are poems that are addressed to somebody else. And so whereas I guess the journey that the three books go on is that physical, I now realize, is very general. And so the men are weeping in the gym. There's a sense of a kind of collective of something. You know, I'm talking about masculinity or men much more generally, which is never the intention. But looking back, I guess you realize that's what it's doing. Playtime is much more of the self and the self through adolescence. So there is, as you say, that kind of lyric I in it. And these poems are addressed to somebody else. And so the you, certainly in the first half of the book, who's kind of going through the things that the book talks about. And so I guess it requires a repositioning of the I and a you. And then I think it also asks questions that I don't necessarily know the answer to around what that does to a reader. So there are different types of you in poetry, right? There's a you which is colloquial, which is replacement of one. So, you know, when you're walking down the street and you see that, which is really saying when one walks down the street and when one sees this thing. And then there's the you as Claudia Rankin uses it, which is an implication or a kind of a pointing off the page towards the reader. You are sat in the car and they say this to you. Mm. The you in this is just a direct kind of form of address to that other person. It's something that someone like Selina Hill does really well. And so as a reader, I guess it's a kind of voyeuristic experience more than it is an experience of kind of being talked to. Mm. And the trick is with that kind of poetry, and you can never know until a reader finds it, if you've got it right or not, is where the room for the reader really is within that. Then kind of is there space for the reader within that kind of scene that you're kind of giving them, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking as you were speaking then that those two different sorts of you. The you that is an address, almost like you said, it entails that distance in which you're talking about or to someone rather than implicating someone. But it seems to me that distance might be kind of productive because the subject that you're discussing is something that we can't get inside until we've been inside it. So if I'm constantly, you can't inhabit that I, and that's in some way part of the power of the book, the acknowledgement of something that the lyric I can't inhabit, and what happens when you kind of come up against something that you can't get inside, and the reader perhaps needs to feel in some way a distance in order to understand that they can't necessarily just jump inside a consciousness that isn't their own.
I think that's really interesting. I think it's really true. I think that there is a sense in which some of these poems, particularly in the first part of the book, I'll read a few of them in a bit, I guess, that seem that are much more, they act like plays, or they act as though scenes that one would watch unfold. And it is because, as you say, you know, you can't write about mental health. You can't write about ideas of depression or kind of suicide ideation, all that kind of stuff, because it's such a personal thing. There's no kind of generalizing metaphor which works. And so the language available to you is either abstract or it's medicalized. Mm. And so it kind of formed or kind of the way that the poems formed themselves was in, well, just like the scenes play out and let people kind of observe them. Mm. And so it's not that it's a passive way of reading, but it struck me there are always two types of poems, broadly speaking. Ones which are kind of walking down a corridor and you happen to glance in and the poem would have been happening anyway, whether you saw it or not. And then poems which require a kind of active engagement from the reader to make sense of them, or the reader is implicated in some way. I think in some of the more kind of abstract or kind of fragmented sequences later on in the book, it's that second one, but certainly in that first part, you are just witness to kind of scenes which seek to give a concrete reality to this thing that is so often beyond language. And as you say, that me as the lyric I can't find a place, you know, I can't inhabit those moments either. I myself was observing them and trying to make sense of them and survive them. And so I think that potentially is where it comes from. But I also think all that always is subconscious, right? Mm. That you can't, to have that in your head as you wrote would be debilitating to the point of kind of blockage, I guess, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, theorizing what you're doing while you're doing it is always a risky endeavor. You kind of reminded me there of, there's a poem, I think it's in the Knotweed sequence, right, where you kind of describe lifting a paving slab and all of the beetles or worms or whatever are kind of ants are crawling underneath.
Yeah.
And you become kind of the voyeur of that world that would be happening whether you saw it or not. Perhaps that kind of is a good illustration of what you're talking about there with the these poems that lift the lid on something or just show something, expose it to a reader, and they make what they will of it. Did you find that turn outwards pushed you into politics as well? Because in the uncivil sequence, which maybe we'll hear you read from, I don't know, that's also a mode of address in some ways, but it's kind of the way that these poems begin to turn outwards to the world, to look at the world and to address it. Did that feel like another sort of risk in this book to look out and address?
Yeah, it felt terrifying. It felt. I think that again, now kind of 3 books in, you begin to sort of chart a sense of where you've been. And so again, the first book was based on my life, but it was about people like us in our early 20s, and so there was nothing really on the line in that. The second one was incredibly exposing, but only of me, and so that kind of felt fine. The third one was incredibly difficult to decide to put in the world, to live with the thought that it was going to be in the world. I built up a very certain sense of self, which was that there's a kind of professional Andrew and a kind of at home Andrew. And professional Andrew, the poet, can go out and read these poems to big audiences that confess things that maybe some of my closest friends didn't know, and that you can kind of be that person that exposes herself and be that vulnerable. And that was just work. And I was very confident with the fact that that was a kind of work self that went out and did those things, that at home deliberately built a home life where that wasn't, where poetry or kind of literature or that kind of work wasn't ever going to be a part of it, that I didn't want any of that to kind of infiltrate that space. And when this book was coming out, what it does is shatter that artificial divide, because the kind of professional self is now talking about the home self. And so that divide that was always artificial just kind of breaks down. And I think that there has been a human cost to that. I don't think that's an easy thing to live with or to do, to have done. I think with the more political work, I think just trying to negotiate the mental health system in this country can't help but lead you into kind of political thinking, the kind of, the devastation of mental health provision in this country because of quote unquote austerity, because of kind of deliberate government defunding, particularly in less affluent areas like in North Manchester where we happen to live. The fact that it would seem to me with mental health crises that you're either ill enough, and the advice we got again and again was that you're either ill enough to go to A&E or you kind of deal with it day by day yourself, or you pay to go private. You pay for private counselling. You kind of pay for private. Consultations and things like that. And so to live with kind of mental health conditions is in itself a kind of political thing. I'm incredibly lucky that I can articulate for myself or for my partner through those systems, because that's not an easy thing to do, to kind of wage your way through systems that seem kind of deliberately intransigent, but also privileged enough to be able to pay for things that otherwise it would take 8-9 months to access in terms of counselling and things like that. So I think that naturally thinking about those things just becomes kind of naturally political. But in a poem like Uncivil, that's kind of looking outwards, again, the fear is that it becomes, anytime you kind of turn it outwards, there's a sense in which it becomes something people might disagree with. Nobody, if I just write about my own lived experience in Playtime, very hard. People can say they've had different experiences, but no one can really disagree with that lived truth. I think when poetry turns itself outwards, it begins to have opinion. that's when it becomes scary, because people might begin to disagree with it and things like that. But I think ultimately, I can't remember what your question was now because I've talked for too long. But yeah, it was a scary book to put out into the world. I very, very nearly cancelled it a few times, or tried to cancel it right up until the day that I knew it was in the shops. I thought, well, what if I called the shops and they just pull it off the shelves? And what if I went round all the shops in the Northwest and bought it, and then it kind of wouldn't be there? What if I called the editor and said, can we cancel it? I didn't really kind of do many launch events. I did one little thing, but I've not really done many events for the book. You know, I'm kind of slowly getting into the headspace where I can do those things. But it was a scary thing to put out into the world, because there's no more pretending that the poet self and the real self are kind of separate people, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, full disclosure, Andrew and I are friends. So, but from having spoken to you over the course of a year or so, it feels like in some ways the book it forces reset on what you want from poetry and what you are able to give to poetry, because it almost seems to be a book, or the way that you speak about it, a lot of the problems or a lot of the anxieties come from knowing that it's a book that will be read. Whereas I suppose, from my position writing the first collection, and I assume from yours as well, you write it not knowing that anyone will read it. So you kind of say whatever you want, sort of thing, and then you build up slowly that resilient, professional poet who can answer questions about death or whatever, and then walk off to the pub and have a glass of wine and just be like, okay, well, that was my job. But the second, it seems to reset again, because you realize this sort of intrusiveness of being read. It seems like you come back to square one of what you're actually doing, which is asking people to read something that you're saying, which I think sometimes we lose until we become extremely vulnerable in a book again, and you start to imagine all the people reading it. I want to take it out of their hands.
It's true. Like, and you know, as you say, like with the first book, I remember being sat in a pub in Oxford. I'd just done some teaching down there for like First Story or something like that. And been sat in a pub with the poet Alan Buckley, and we were talking about the book coming out. And I remember just saying to him, the thing that I'm really scared about is that no one will read it, that nobody will notice it comes out. And that genuinely is the fear with the first book, with all the kind of head starts, etc., that I had with the publisher, you know, knowing that it would be stocked in bookshops, all that kind of stuff. You have this intrinsic fear that it won't be read. And then that's replaced, as you described, by this other fear, which is, oh God, I've got a readership and people will read it. And this book is so different to the first two that, you know, with the second book, I remember saying at the time, like, if you didn't like the first one, you're going to hate the second one. Like, the second one is so much a kind of twin of the first one in a way, in terms of style, that it was always going to appeal to the same readership. Whereas this one maybe doesn't, maybe does, kind of, I don't know really. It's not maybe been out long enough, but it's a kind of departure, I guess, in that sense. But it's only really recently that reset's an interesting word, like trying to sort of gather again what I think I want my own poetry to do for me, what kind of life I want to live, all that kind of stuff. That these poems were being written as they were being experienced, which is the last 5 or 6 years. So like at the start, you know, you listed off that kind of daft list of prizes and shortlistings and things like that the first book had. And the experience of that for me was that I kind of, despite the way that I grew up, knew very little about that world, was kind of in this kind of mad world of some of the people that you've never met, kind of saying really nice things to you and giving you things and giving you free booze. And my editor would ring me up and say, oh God, it's on the shortlist for this, or you've been shortlisted for this. And then I'd put the phone down and then it'd ring again. It'd be my partner kind of in hysterics, or I'd be thinking about, could I go to that event because can I leave him alone? And that be safe? Or does he have to come with me? And I was kind of holding both those things at once, the kind of really private self and the public self that I was kind of wasn't in control of. And it's only kind of recently, after the kind of whirlwind of that you sit back and you kind of go, right, so what is it that I really want? what is it that I'm doing it for? How much of the self do I want to kind of put into the work? How much do you want to be private? And so, yeah, it's just, it's been this book is almost like, when someone reads that kind of list of accolades, which I'm incredibly, grateful for. Proud of is not quite the right word because it's always random, but, I like, I enjoy that the book did what it did. And you almost then want to hold up this at the other side of it and say, yeah, but this was happening at the same time.
Mm.
So it was that, but it was also this. Mm. And the only way I found to survive that was to split the self. And then this book is, in many ways, then I guess the kind of bringing back together of those two halves, which then, now moving forward, maybe it's other stuff, maybe I can kind of radically write something else. I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I was going to ask you about this later, but I think you just answered. It's almost like Pandemonium is, I'm trying to think in my head of what I mean, but like, if you imagine like a river and there are like two currents running underneath, and perhaps the first two books are the life that you put out, the things that people saw, and the other one was always running an undercurrent underneath, and this third book kind of dredges up that other side, and that's always going to be a scary thing because it's not the public face of you as a poet. It's your private face that you can't control.
That river idea, yeah, it's that bringing together of those two things, that kind of the inability to divide those two selves anymore.
Yeah.
And maybe not needing to, this is historical stuff mostly.
Yeah. I mean, historical stuff, did you feel that it's a difficult question, one that you might not have an answer to, but did this feel like a book that you kind of had to write or to get out, or was that, even that question itself, part of the problem with the book, and that did something come from the fact that you couldn't decide whether it was something you had to do or not?
Yeah, and I think, the poems in the first half of the book, I will read in a second, I promise. Like they were written as it was being experienced, as a way of just surviving it. So they were written pre-playtime, kind of around the same time that Physical came out, I guess. So kind of 5-6 years old, but just written as a way of kind of surviving what was happening at the time. And then the later stuff in the book obviously kind of comes later, or you go back and you edit it, you reshape it. I think there was a big question about whether I should do it, whether I wanted to, whether that was stuff that should ever be out there, whether it was ethically right to publish it. And the questions of ethics are really important, I think, and worth kind of saying, my partner, Ben, who it's about, mainly read the poems, kind of edited them, took stuff out, kind of changed things, kind of had that editorial control that I felt was really important. He read them before Robin did at Cape. And my sister, there's a poem about my nephew who died, like my sister read that, kind of gave permission for it to be in the book. I felt the people who could consent to it did, and got kind of power of changing things and stuff like that. And ultimately, the stuff that we were talking about became to feel historical enough that we were in a different phase of our lives, that things had moved forward, that the work itself was a kind of historical document rather than a kind of diary of lived experience. And I think that time just allowed it to become something else, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the distance always makes a poem kind of possible as well, because it would be much different if that wasn't a historical situation or something that was still uncontained or something. Why don't you go ahead and read some of the poems from the first sequence? So for people who haven't read Pandemonium yet, boo, go and buy a copy. You won't regret it. But it has this, it's made up of a series of sequences, and that's perhaps something we can talk about in a bit. But Andrew, do you want to read a couple of poems from the first sequence?
Yeah, I'll just read a couple of the opening ones, I guess. Passion play. Open audition to be held in the corridor of a one-bedroom flat. Let me walk you through it first. Start in the living room, a slow, deliberate procession to the bathroom. We need someone with experience of movement who understands how best to capture that writhing across the tiles to try and get the... We'll need someone to play the bleach, someone light enough to pick up, who won't mind being thrown around. And we'll need a drummer for the exact sound of a head banging against a stud partition wall. We need someone for the clothes piled up in the corner to be sat in whilst weeping, someone for the lock, for the nurse down the line, someone for the door. It begins each time with a quiet withdrawal from the self, as though the body steps back from its own skin, folds in on itself, and without its wall of bone behind it, the skin becomes too sensitive to touch, and the brain begins to crease itself into smaller and smaller squares, making itself less visible, the way animals might when under attack. And the washing piles up in the basket, and the hair isn't clean for days, and each time it dawns on me too late what is about to happen. I say something unconsidered, and you lay down weeping in the hallway, curled up by the door like a draft excluder. I'll finish with routine. It's an unusually busy night for the ambulances, so I check that you're still lucid and then get told to call a taxi to A&E, which is unusually busy for a weeknight at 7 p.m. And so we wait for hours, get ushered into the unusual brightness of the triage room and then back out to wait again as your body attempts to come to terms with what's inside of it. And they decide it's best to send you home, but then vomiting begins and the hospital wards are full, unusually overstretched with bodies of the dying and the not today dying. So you are taken to a room where an old man is crying out in his sleep and a curtain is drawn between you. I sleep on the tiled floor like a dog by your bed. At 5 a.m., an orderly comes to take you to a ward, and though it isn't yet visiting hours, when usually they allow me to stay for a while, a text comes through from home that in the night our new niece arrived into the world. So much life arriving every day. Too bright. Too bright. I let you sleep.
Thank you very much. You talk there at the end of that poem about life arriving, and there's this kind of constant interchange in the book between the havoc of the mind and things going wrong, and then life arriving, whether that's a niece here at the end of this poem or in the garden, and the garden is a big theme that runs through the book. And I wonder, that we often kind of debate, or I see people debate this idea of nature as healing or nature cure. And, often it can seem a quack response to the proper medicinal treatment or therapeutic treatment of depression or anxiety, to tell someone to go for a walk or to sit in a field or something. And you have a quote as well from Alexander Lukashenko, "The field heals everyone." And there's kind of an irony there as well, I think, in just the field heals everyone coming from someone like Lukashenko. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way that nature works in this collection, and what its power to heal might be, or its power to teach us, or why the turn to nature.
It's interesting. And Lukashenko said that about COVID. That was his response to COVID. The tractor heals everyone. The field heals everything. And that was this kind of COVID plan. Nature, so we bought this house maybe 5-6 years ago with this kind of long, kind of tumble down garden that seemed to me always kind of out of control. And I try my best to keep on top of it. And then you go back 2 weeks later and it's just kind of mad again. It's kind of overgrown. And so the garden, whilst I find it a kind of cathartic place to be, and I find it relaxing, I also find it very scary and kind of untamable and kind of out of control. And when we moved in, there was this knotweed in the garden. And listeners of Gardeners Question Time amongst us will know that kind of knotweed is this impossible thing to get rid of. It was brought over by the Victorians as a kind of decorative thing, but it has these incredibly long and deep roots that are just almost impossible to kill. So it costs a fortune to kind of pay to get it removed. And knotweed just became this metaphor that seems so apt for kind of mental health. It's an ability to kind of get better, move beyond it, the kind of deep lying roots of it. Every so often, a kind of man in a massive red boiler suit, like something out of Chernobyl, would come and just kind of nuke the ground around where it was and in an attempt to get rid of it and kind of scorch the earth. But I think more broadly, and so that, the sonnets at the end of the book, these knotweed poems, they're a way of kind of trying just to kind of write the idea of mental health through the garden. And, because mental health, again, as I said earlier, is such an abstract thing and so unique to everyone that goes through it. There's no image of depression that everyone has. There's no kind of simile about anxiety that everybody has. The only way to do it is to show a physical environment that is changed by the inside self. Like Kay Ryan's got this amazing poem called Carrying a Ladder, which is like we're all carrying an invisible ladder, but it makes itself known. And it's this wonderful idea of kind of, we don't know what's internal, but it makes itself known in the environment. And there's just something about the garden that lends itself to that kind of writing. Yeah. I think more broadly, nature, the thing about what happened with Ben and kind of mental health, there's a poem about George, my nephew, who died in childbirth. There's one poem about the pandemic. Pandemonium was written long before kind of COVID. But the poem about my nephew ends with, we think we're safe, we think ourselves secure, but life sometimes short circuits and nature comes knocking at the door. And I think that I was really thinking about this idea of me and all my privilege and all my kind of safety and security, thinking that I had a safe life, thinking that kind of nature is out there, but the life that you build for yourself is somehow separate from that and kind of safe. And if the pandemic's taught us anything, it's that that's not true. The kind of nature comes knocking at the door, this idea that you can be very quickly kind of confronted with things, infant loss, these kind of mental health episodes, the COVID, which one kind of just wasn't expecting. And so nature somehow is always kind of knocking at the door, kind of literally kind of trying to infiltrate a lot of these poems, I guess, or it's always somehow in the background of them kind of threatening to overwhelm the kind of tidiness of a life that one had tried to build, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, all the way through the book, there's these sense of, or the sense of intrusion, I think, or of almost like an uncanny or haunting thing going on. Even that first epigraph from Eugene O'Neill. There's no peace in houses. There's no peace in houses. There's no rest living with folk. Something's always living with you. Desire Under the Elms, which is this great Eugene O'Neill play that we went to see. Me and my mum went to see Desire Under the Elms. And then these two old women in front of us turned to each other at the end and went, well, there were no elms. And it was, well, they'd only come to see it because they might have elms. But Desire Under the Elms is this really fascinating play about, it's not really about kind of the themes of this book, but it's very much about a kind of a sense of self connected to a sense of place and things like that, I guess. But there are no elms in it. Oh, no elms.
There were no elms. It was just a great moment.
Do you want to do us another reading? It's up to you where you take it from.
Fab. I can read Swan, I guess. So Swan is this kind of longer extended poem in 8 short parts. I went to see Swan Lake, Matthew Bourne's reinvention of Swan Lake, and was just beguiled by what he'd done to it. He kind of queers Swan Lake. He makes it, I think, about mental health in my reading of it, and about kind of queerness and solitude. I remember walking into my office at university the next day and going, I'm going to write an avant-garde poem about a swan. And so that's what I tried to do, called Swan 1. The lake is calm tonight. The moon has dropped white feathers on the water. Tonight, the lake is calm. The wavelets lap like rustling wings. The lake tonight is calm. But look, who is coming in to land, to tear the peace asunder. 2. My first time in water, I was unnaturally good, heavier somehow, so much power inside me, arms forcing the water away like prizing someone's mouth apart to take out what's inside. Only ever more water that comes through. 3. Then the year everything was swan, feathers on my pillow on the floor, wet prints in the hallway where I'd walked, men in white coats, little pellets in their hands, the shadow of my back curved against a wall. 4. The black swan of debt, the black swan of my own body, of my mum, the black swan of sex, the black swan of the house, of the wall, the loft, the damp, the black swan of rain, the black swan of the dog, the black swan of weddings, the black swan of the neighbours, of him, each one fury-footed in my stomach. 5. Then the year everything was darkness, the red beak of my longing, the wedge of men in flight from club to club, banked in at every bar, loneliness, as though I'm dying of thirst. I think the men must be where water is. I always go face first to drink. 6. Sing a swan of sixpence, a broken-hearted guy, 24 whoopers kept locked up inside. When the door was opened, the swans began to hiss. What is the solution for such a man as this? They see you in the living room saying things are wrong. They see you napping fitfully when all your strength is gone. Your mind is in the puddle now, soaking up the rain. They're coming now to peck at it, your damp and ruined brain. 7. Queen. Mother, don't eat me. Mother, I'm trying so hard to get better. I'm sorry, I'm a queer. Remember how small I was, mother? Newly hatched cygnet, like a cloud fallen down on the water. Now it's only rain, mother. So much of it, hitting the lake, bringing it to the boil. 8. I plucked each feather from myself, slight resistance, and then a rising out like pulling up a weed. When I was bald, I beheld myself in the mirror of the water's edge. My neck looked ridiculous, my eyes the only part of me that still had life. I raised each failed wing, just flesh now, nothing for the wind to get up under. The mirror cracked with the tides. I reared up, I jumped, I watched myself, broken, fall towards myself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could just tell us one of the defining features of this book, and I know that is something that you've done before in your other books too, but as sequences. There's only a couple of poems in this book that are on their own and not at least headed under a section or a sequence. I don't know what you prefer to think of them as. But I wonder if there was something that you felt had shifted in your sense of the poem and what the poem can do, and if the sequence was pushing beyond that, or what made you turn to writing sequences? Did you write one and then just keep on going back, or the Swan seems to have been kind of planned, like you said, as a whole thing? How did it work, and do you have a sense of why?
Swan, I really wanted to just challenge myself and see if I could do it. I think that, I know what I felt I had a sense of what an Andrew McMillan poem was, and it's probably the closest thing in this book is probably that poem called Training, that kind of exists as a 1.5 page kind of block, like a Sharon Oldsyan block of something that enjambs, that kind of tells the story of a body and kind of opens out something at the end. And I remember a review of the second book, Playtime, that just said, I would have welcomed more surprise. And there is part of me that is just a competitive bastard and kind of goes, well, you want surprise, have an 8-page poem about a swan. And I kind of like to push myself in that way. Again, the kind of privilege of having a readership is that you can experiment and you can kind of try stuff and see what works. But I think also just I wonder if the sequence, we've seen a return of the long poem in recent years, kind of book length kind of projects. I wonder if it's just a response to the time that you live in, that one lives through, that becomes, the sequence becomes a kind of way of responding to that. And I guess also I've become less and less interested in writing a poem about the thing. So that idea of, right, I'm going to write a poem about this, I'll put that title at the top of the page, and this is my poem about that. That just interests me less and less as I get older. And I'm much more interested in kind of writing around something, writing towards it, kind of almost holding the subject in the middle and seeing which ways you can kind of come in at it in different ways. And so a lot of the poems in the book ended up just being ways of trying to do that, not write about it, but write into it or around it, towards it. And just see what happened. And I just like the idea of beginning to experiment with, I've always been interested in the way that you can put a book together. So what happens if you put the title on a page on its own, and then the epigraph is on the next page, and then you can just have a 6-line poem on a page on its own without a title, and then you move on. And stuff like that I think you can't ask maybe as a new poet, or you feel more reluctant to ask. I think there's a kind of bravado that comes with just having done it once or twice before, where you think, well, let's try this and see if it works. Let's see if it's possible to do this. And what happens when you give the poems their own space? So Swan is on 8 different pages because it's 8 different sections. There's no reason why it couldn't have just been 1, 2, 3, 4 underneath each other with Swan at the top. I thought, right, what happens if you put Swan, the word, on a page on its own? And then what happens if you have the first section on the next page? And then what happens if you give these poems a kind of space in which they're figuring themselves out, I guess. And I just wanted to see if I could extend myself in that way. And it was never a conscious thing. It just seemed to me that that's what the kind of life, or that's what the material was demanding of it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that this book, I sat down to read it and I couldn't stop. Obviously a compliment, but also I think because it seems to exist as a whole as well, and perhaps that pacing that you're able to give it by including each poem on a new page and giving these discrete sections gives the reader the chance to kind of breathe a little bit and to sit with it and almost to elongate the experience of smaller poems and to make them something that might feel like it takes longer or something like that. Like there's a sense of breath or space around it. But I like that idea of the sequences as trying repeatedly to get towards something. And, you can make an attempt and you don't actually have to get there, and then you can make another attempt, and somehow in making all the attempts, you build up some set of possibilities or answers or something.
Because it's about, sorry, I interrupted you then, but it's about leaning into the inherent failure that is inherent in poetry, that all poetry fails. And so one can't write a poem about mental health. One can't write an experimental poem about Matthew Bond's Swan Lake. You just can't do it. You can't write sonnets about the garden. They'll always fail. Poetry always fails. Language is too deficient. The thing that you want to write is over there, and you try and get slightly closer to it every time. And once you accept that failure, then I think poetry becomes much more interesting because you stop trying to perfect it and you stop sweating over that exact image that will perfectly capture the thing. Well, you try, oh, I'll try again. The only other long thing that I ever wrote is in the first book, that kind of mad poem that's in the middle of Physical, called Protest of the Physical. And it ends, I had to look at it for something the other day, and it just ends with the line, I should have tried harder. And that to me was an admittance about the relationship that the poem's about, but it was an admittance of the poem itself. I could have tried harder with it. I should have tried harder. The poem itself failed in what it sets out to do. And all poetry fails. All art fails to a certain extent. And the minute that you accept that and lean into it, then I think the potential of what a poem could be gets kind of blown apart in a way.
Yeah, it seems as well that, I mean, this is something I'm thinking about as well, but I found myself recently being almost less interested in the poem and more interested in poetry. So, you know, like, the poem doesn't have to be perfect. The poem doesn't have to kind of clinch at the end and have that kind of Larkin-esque finish or something. And it can be experienced as a whole book of poetry. And there's something actually different about experiencing poetry than in looking to perfect each individual poem. And perhaps that comes from the sense of knowing that it will be a book as well, because I suppose when you write your first book, you work on each individual poem and then you send them to the magazine, and then you slowly build up a number of poems. And I suppose it would be relatively unusual. I mean, there are people that have done it, but to write a first book that is conceived of as a book or one long poem or something like that. And perhaps that's something that comes with the confidence to know that you can put this inside a book and you can think of it as a...
And I think you're right. I mean, I think, you know, certainly how I learned poetry was that you would write individual poems, you would then send them to magazines, you might do a pamphlet, you might then do a collection. And as you say, I think it's a brave for a debut. I think of Hannah Sullivan, I think of Stern, I think of Jay's first book, these kind of collections that seem to me conceived as a whole. It seems to me such an exciting thing to do, and just not something I was brave enough to do. But I think, like, I just don't send stuff out anymore. Like, that's not part of just what I just don't send stuff to magazines anymore. Like, none of these poems were published, which is also part of the fear because they'd not been tested out and I never read them in public. But none of them had really been published anywhere because I just don't really send stuff out because it never occurs to me to anymore. I'm much more, like you say, interested in not the poem, but how it fits within the book, what you might conceive the book to be. Or the next thing I'm thinking about is this like pamphlet that I know has got 5 poems that are kind of all about the same thing, sort of thing. And it's how that just seems at the minute to me much more interesting, I guess, than trying to sort of write the good single poem. Also, I've never been able to do, or not in a way, you know, none of the poems in Physical were published in magazines, really. None of the ones that people liked or remembered. Some of the stuff in Playtime was published, but that was kind of really riding the coattails of the success of the first book. None of this stuff in Pandemonium felt as though it was really excerptable. Certainly in that first section, there are little things that on their own just don't make sense or don't really work. But put together as a whole, you kind of hope that they begin to. So yeah, I guess I'd not thought of it like that. But yeah, poetry rather than the poem. I like that way of thinking about it.
Right, well, it's been a pleasure. I wonder if you want to finish off with a poem or two before
It's been a pleasure. It's great to be here. Redline's always been very kind to me. I came over a few years ago and read from Playtime. And it's great that the festival's carrying on this year online. So thank you to Mark and the whole team and all the work that you do. Thank you to Seán for the chat. I'll read just the final 2 poems, I guess, of the Let's Not Read sequence. Love, forgive me. Most of the time, I can't see the borders of the garden for the trees, can't tell plant from weed. I didn't know how best to save you from yourself, how to lead your mind back up the path to the house of itself. I was gone too much and didn't know whether it was best to let you sleep or take you for a walk or let you sit in silence or encourage you to talk. Those years, love, were like trying to sift armfuls of soil for the tiniest of seeds. And yes, sometimes I wanted to split and scatter. Sometimes I couldn't stand the screaming anymore. More things survive in the garden now. The more weeds come down, the more roses open up their clenched faces. Descending into the honeycomb cities, I returned to the ground already wetted by the transient rains. All the windows of our house are wide open. Climbing the stairs is like reaching my face into the fridge. The bedroom is alive with your breathing, the clattering teeth of the blinds. Outside, the night is perfectly tuned. Slow forcing of the plum trees and their fruit, buzz of motorbikes on the roads. Undressing to land beside you all night, the winds come over us like intermittent water. Then, I'm not sure what I mean by this, but I'll spend my lifetime coming home to you. You know, Seán, I've been thinking, when I say all night the winds come over us, does that sound like some sort of like sad moment of flatulence in a poem? Because what I meant was like the wind coming through the window, but then I realised that if you write in a poem, all night the winds come over us, it sounds slightly like two people in a bed that can't stop farting. But there we go. That's how the book ends.
I mean, what a note to end on. No, my mind didn't go there at all. I thought of winds and the weather, but sure.
There we go. Good.
Alternate
That's
reading.
What I wanted.
Yeah, there we go. All right. Thank you very much. Everyone go and buy a copy of Andrew's book, Pandemonium, the entire backlist, everything. It's required reading. And go to all the other events at Red Line. There's so many great ones lined up, some of them featuring me. Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. A pleasure.
Thank you.